way back in chapter 20, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 21, there's the record of his trip to and his arrival at Jerusalem, which ended his third missionary journey. We read in verse 17 of Acts 20, "And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly." And Paul reports to them the great blessings of God during the third missionary journey. It was just a wonderful time with the Jerusalem church. In verses 26 and 27, again, Paul's in Jerusalem. He goes into the temple. And beginning in verse 28, some who had seen him with Trophimus, a Gentile, made the assumption that Paul had taken that man, that Gentile, into the temple. Based on that assumption, they accuse him of defiling the temple. And a great riot ensued. So you have an assumption that started a great riot. The danger of assuming. But that's not our message. The people were about to kill Paul. Again, all based upon an assumption. Verses 30 through 34, they arrest Paul, and as they were walking up the stairs to the castle, where Paul was being taken as a prisoner, multitudes shouted, "Away with him!" Paul asks permission to speak to the multitude. And they gave him permission. And he proceeds in chapter 22 to declare how that the Lord Jesus Christ saved his soul. He would then stand trial before the Sanhedrin in chapter 23, before Felix 2 times in chapter 24, before Festus in chapter 25, and before Agrippa in chapter 26. He is declared innocent by both Festus and Agrippa, and he is sent to Rome. And he is sent to Rome because Paul appeals, even though he's innocent, he appeals to Caesar. From Jerusalem to Rome would be a journey by water of about 2,100 miles. And it would be Paul's last recorded voyage. And this 27th chapter is Luke's account of this dramatic voyage to Rome. It is one of the narrative chapters of the Bible, told in first person by Luke. So what we have here is an eyewitness account of what took place during this voyage. Most of the narrative, verses 14 through 44, deals with a storm. A storm that ultimately ended in shipwreck, which, by the way, would have been Paul's 4th shipwreck. And the Lord leads Luke to record the details of this event, no doubt for our learning. What we have here is a picture, the 27th chapter. It is a picture of life and how we ought to live our life as a child of God, regardless of circumstances. Now we want to read verses 21 through 25. Acts 27, verses 21 through 25. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. But there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. So what we read here takes place in the midst of a storm. Luke records in verse 21, Paul stood forth. And then he records what Paul said. So Paul stood forth. And he makes a declaration to pagan sailors, to heathen prisoners. It is a declaration concerning his relation with God. What Paul declares is what is the most important, the most significant, the most pressing matter at that time. What Paul declared in the midst of the storm is what really matters. Nothing else was more worthy of attention than what Paul declares in our text. Our subject this morning is the most important aspect of life. We lose sight of that many, many times. The most important aspect of life. So let's look first of all at Paul's declaration. And Paul stood forth. You need to see him there. He is standing before 275 other people. Because we are told in verse 37 that there are 276 people aboard this ship. So Paul is standing before 275 other people. And we read in verse 14 that there was a tempestuous, a violent and turbulent wind, one that would cause great commotion, called Euroclydon. It's a typhoon wind. It's a whirlwind. And Paul stood forth. He could feel the winds, and there he stands. We read in verse 15, the ship was caught. That is, it was trapped by the wind and carried by the force of the wind and the waves, and could not bear up into the wind. We let her drive. That is, we just let go. There's nothing we could do. So the ship is completely under the control of the winds and the waves. And Paul stood forth. It was during this time that Paul stood forth. As he's standing there, he can feel the surge and swell of the sea. And there he stands. And I'm sure it's like, if you keep a mark there and go over to Psalm 107, I'm sure it's like what we read in Psalm 107, verses 25 through verse 27. For he commandeth and raiseth the stormy wind, which lifteth up the waves thereof. They mount up to the heaven, they go down again to the depths. Their soul is melted because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man and are at their wits' end. And I believe that pretty much describes what was going on in this ship that night. The winds are howling. The winds are swirling. The waves are rising violently and battering and hammering the ship. Everything seems to be out of control. The ship is carried to the top of the wave and then plummets down. And the people on board are staggering, trying to have some sense of balance. Havoc and chaos are everywhere, and Paul stood forth. It's an amazing statement. And Paul stood forth, feeling the force of the winds, feeling the power of the waves, and there he stands. And no doubt, with a loud voice, so that it could be heard above all that was going on. Paul's not whispering here. Nobody would be able to hear him. And no doubt with a tone of absolute assurance, and certainty, and boldness and courage, he exhorts these who are in a state of fear and distress. He exhorts them in verse 22. Be of good cheer. That doesn't mean be happy. That means be of good courage. And we could show you that through the Gospels, but we're not going to take the time. It is a call for them to be something contrary to what they currently were. Be of good cheer. The basis of this, verse 23, for there stood by me this night the angel of God. And then comes a declaration of his relation, Paul's relation to God. He says, whose I am and whom I serve. He refers to God twice in that statement by the word whose and whom. And he refers to himself in relation to him. God is the focus. God is the emphasis. Paul stood forth, and we hear him declare his relation to God. We hear him declare his view of God. A storm is going on. Chaos is everywhere. And Paul declares his view of God. He basically says, God is the owner. God is the master. We hear him also declare his view of himself. I am his property. I am his servant. And Paul stood forth. We hear him speak concerning his position with regard to God. Whose I am, whom I serve. What's Paul focusing on? Well, it's not the storm. It's God. He is declaring his perspective of life. I belong to God. And I serve him. And it's personal. And it's present tense. So Paul stood forth, and he identifies himself with God. He declares, first of all, that he belongs to the Lord. We hear him with reference to God, whose I am. What Paul said to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 6:19, he realized of himself, you're not your own, for ye are bought with a price. So in the midst of the fierce winds, in the midst of the crashing waves, Paul stands up and confidently declares, I belong to God. It is a statement of his confidence, of the Lord's care for him. It is a statement that he is under the watchful care and protection of the Lord. That he is in the sheltering hand of the Lord. It is a statement that he has been redeemed, whose I am. It is a statement of privilege. He is saying, I belong to the Lord. I am his. It is a statement of God's love, of God's grace, of God's mercy, of God's care. Whose I am. Again, it is a statement of confidence that the Lord is his mighty, loving, wise, and unfailing friend. Whose I am. Again, and Paul stood forth. In the midst of the fierce winds, and the crashing waves, and the ship being tossed, and he declares with reference to God, whose I am. And with those words are a felt responsibility. I belong to God. That is, I have a responsibility to God. There's never a time when that's not true. What is going on all around you is not what really matters. What really matters is, I belong to God. I belong to God. We lose sight of what really matters. The storm is not what really mattered in this. What really mattered is his relation to God. Secondly, he identifies or he declares his position in life. Whom I serve. This is my occupation. This is my purpose in life. He is saying, I am a servant of the Lord. That means that he is surrendered to the government of God. That means that he is willingly under the government of God. You can complain and gripe all you want about government, but you're not under that government. You're under the government of God, and that's a perfect government. He is upon the earth to serve God's interest. Whom I serve. He is declaring his aspiration in life. He is declaring that the Lord is his resolve, his purpose, his object, his aim, his passion. He is declaring that the Lord is his priority. In the midst of the fierce winds, in the midst of the crashing waves and the tall ship, we hear him say, whom I serve. He is declaring his commitment to God. He is declaring that his life has been set apart for God. He is declaring his desire is to please God. He is declaring that the Lord is what dominates him. The storm doesn't dominate him. What dominates him is the Lord. The storm must never dominate us. The circumstances of life must never dominate us. And if they do, we're in the wrong position. I am a servant of the Lord. That is, yes, the storm is raging. I can see the storm. I can feel the storm. I am experiencing the storm. But in the storm, I'm here to serve God. And that's always so. That's what really matters. So he's declaring his obligation in life. He is declaring his opportunity in life. It is not our obligation to escape the storm. It is our obligation to serve God in the storm. That's our obligation. That's our duty. That's our responsibility. That is our opportunity. I have the opportunity to serve God in this life. Whether it be calm or whether it be storm, that's not what matters. My opportunity is to serve God. So he declares, I belong to God. He declares, I am here to serve God. And then he declares his faith. Again, Paul stood forth, and after exhorting those who are on board to be of good cheer, which is a call to courage and confidence and tranquility, the opposite of everything that they were at present. And then in verse 23 and 24, for there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that shall sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, based upon what I've just told you, be of good cheer, for I believe God. And then he repeats the exhortation. For I believe God. Again, personal, present tense, the swirling and fierce wind, the overwhelming waves, the creaking of the ship, the chaos and the terror on board that ship have no bearing upon this. I believe God. The storm has no bearing upon I believe God. 2 Timothy 1 verse 12, we hear Paul say, I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able. So in our text, Paul is absolutely confident and certain that God's in control, and that God would fulfill his word. For I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me, even as it was told me by God. So, our text is the God-inspired recording of Luke, of Paul standing forth in the midst of the fierce and life-threatening storm, declaring very clearly, declaring very pointedly, without any hesitation, without any bashfulness, without any timidness, his relationship with God. So we hear him loud and clear. I belong to God. He is my owner, and he has absolute right over my life, and I am here in this storm, on this ship, as a prisoner, being taken to Rome. I am here to serve him, to do his work his way. And I believe that it will be just as God says. Nothing changes that. That must be us. So in our text, Paul considers himself in relation to God. And this is what matters. Our relationship to God. That's what really matters. This is the most important aspect of our lives. Again, Paul stood forth. The winds and the waves are hammering that ship. The sun and the stars, we're told, are still hidden. And Paul boldly and resolutely declares his relation to God. Don't allow the circumstances of life to cause you to lose sight of who you are in relation to God. So what truly mattered was not the fierce and overwhelming winds and waves, nor the creaking of the ship, but the most important and significant matter is his relation to God. Again, don't lose sight of the fact that Paul could feel the waves or the wind. He could feel the waves. He could feel the ship being hurled about. He's personally, just as much as everyone else on that ship, he's personally experiencing it all. But he stands up and he declares his relation to God. So what was on his mind during the storm? God. And his relation to God. Don't let the storm, don't let circumstances cause you to lose sight of God. And he views his circumstances in light of his relation to God. There are many circumstances that we do not like. There are many circumstances that we would never, ever choose. But we need to view them in light of God. And view them in light of who we are in relation to God. That's what we must not lose sight of, because that's what matters. That's what matters. The most important and significant thing, believe it or not, is not the bills that are due. I didn't say it's not important. I said it's not the most important. It's not the most significant. Nor are the problems and needs that we face. And again, I did not say the problems are unimportant. That's not what I said. They're not the most important. They never are. Or they never should be. And our needs. Yes, needs are real. We can see them. We can feel them. They're real. But it's not the most important aspect of our life. The most important aspect of our life is our relation to God. That is always the main matter. That is always the most pressing matter. And it is what should pique our deepest interest. What piques our deepest interest should not be the breaking news, whatever it is. Breaking news. Oh, everybody forget God. Everybody forget your relationship to God. This is really important. The breaking news is never the most important thing. Our relation to God. I belong to Him, whatever the breaking news is. I belong to Him. Whatever the breaking news is, I'm here to serve Him. And whatever the breaking news is, Paul says, I believe God. I believe God. So in the midst of terrible turmoil and overwhelming concerns, and again, it was right, nothing wrong with being concerned in the storm, but never let it become the main thing. And we hear Paul say in the midst of the turmoil and the overwhelming concerns, there stood by me this night. There stood by me this night. This night. For this night is a night of terrible storm. There stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, whom I serve. I believe God. It is a declaration of his personal relation to God. And that is what overrides everything else. Whatever else is going on, this overrides everything. So let's look at the extent of Paul's declaration. How far do you take it? I belong to God. How far do you take that? Paul says, I'm here to serve God. How far do you take that? I believe God. How far do you take that? Throughout the account, there are a variety of events and places and circumstances. These are indicated by the word when. We see that word many times. And by the word then, and the phrases the next day, and the phrase much time was spent, and the phrase not long after, and the phrase and it came to pass. All of these are words and phrases of time and connection. Connecting of events. And regardless of place, Paul realized he was the Lord's. Regardless of place. And he realized, regardless of place, that he was the servant of the Lord. And regardless of place, he believed God. Again, throughout the account, there are a variety of events. There are a variety of changes. It's all a picture of life. In verse 3, without reading these verses, you can read them on your own. There's an act of kindness shown to Paul. And when others show us kindness, we enjoy that. But don't forget, you are the Lord's, you are the servant of His, and you believe Him. The kindness of others is not the main thing. Our relationship to God is the main thing. There was liberty. There was a time of sweet fellowship and encouragement amongst friends in those first few verses. Those are all enjoyable things. But what's the most important thing in that is our relationship with God. In verse 4, there were some contrary winds, which resulted in a slight change of course. And in such, Paul realized, I am the Lord's, I am the servant of the Lord, and I believe God. In verses 5 and 6, there's a change of ships. And in verse 7, due to contrary winds, there was slow sailing. That is, things weren't moving quite like they wanted them to. They preferred to go faster. And in verse 8, they almost wreck. And in it all, Paul realizes, I belong to God. I'm here to serve God. And I believe God. They come unto a place which is called the Fair Havens. It's now a time of comfort. It's a time of rest. An enjoyable time. And in such, the most important matter is not our comfort. I know that's a shock to not people here, but that's a shock to the world. The main matter is not our rest. The main matter is our relationship with the Lord. That's always so. In this time of comfort and rest, Paul was aware, I belong to God. I'm here to serve God, and I believe God. In verses 10 and 11, Paul gives his opinion, and his opinion and his advice is not heeded or believed. But that's not what's most important. Someone disagrees with you, somebody doesn't follow your advice, that's not the main matter in life. The main matter is your relationship with God. In verse 12, because the Fair Havens were not large enough to winter in other words, the seasons were beginning to change. But regardless of the season, we belong to God. We're here to serve Him, and we need to keep on believing Him. In verse 13, they move on, and we read, the south wind blew softly. There was smooth sailing. It was a time of ease. But again, this isn't the most important matter. The most important matter is relationship and position with God. So in such times of smooth sailing and ease, do not lose sight of the fact that you belong to God, that you're here to serve God, and you keep on believing God. Well, then in verse 14, the storm came. We read in verse 14, again, they just come out of smooth sailing, but not long after. But not long after the gentle blowing south wind, there arose, that is, suddenly and without warning, a tempestuous, a violent and turbulent wind called Euroclydon, a typhoon-like wind. And we read in verse 15, the ship was caught, or was trapped and under the control of the storm. Now, wouldn't you rather be back in the south wind, blowing softly, and just sailing along, enjoying the trip? Well, of course you would. Who wouldn't? But that's not where they are now. And you can spend your time saying, oh, I sure wish we were back there. But you're not. But remember, you belong to God. You're to serve God in whatever the circumstances, and you're to keep on believing God. In verse 16 and 17, the storm brought much damage to the ship. The stormy wind carried them to a certain island, which is called Clauda, where they did find some relief. And they had an opportunity to make some repairs. They couldn't stay there because there were dangerous quicksands. So they set sail again. And in verse 18, all seems to be out of control. Verse 19 is a time of loss. Verse 20 is a time of darkness and no direction. A time of great weariness, it says, and no small tempest lay on us. It was a time of helplessness. All hope that we should be saved was then taken away. And then we read in verse 27, but when the 14th night was come, so the storm was long and ongoing, and then notice as we were driven up and down, it was a time of great discomfort, a time of fear. Also in verse 27, there is some encouragement. It says they drew near to some country, but that was soon followed by shipwreck. And in verse 42, the soldiers desire to kill the prisoners, lest they escape. But in verse 43, Julius intervenes, and he does so for the sake of Paul, and he commands everyone overboard in verses 43 and 44. And then you notice those two words, broken pieces. And sometimes that's what life is, broken pieces. And then you come to chapter 28 and verse 2, and there's rain and there's cold. But God provided a time of warmth. All the changes in life. And change can be very upsetting. Change can be very difficult. Change can be good. But in it all, the most important matter is our relation and position with God. That's the most important matter. Do I wish things were different? Yes, I do. Do I wish I could go back 50 years? Yes, I do. I'll be honest. But guess what? That's not happening. And I can't get caught up in that. That can't become the main matter. Whatever my circumstance is right now, I belong to God, and I am to serve Him, and I am to keep on believing Him. That is the most important matter. And we must never, ever lose sight of that. Again, the places, the events, the happenings, the circumstances are never the main thing. They can be very important, but they're not the main thing. Our relation and position with God is the main thing. So regardless of place, event, or circumstance, there must be this realization and awareness. You know what? I belong to God. I'm His, and I'm not my own. And I am here to serve God, regardless of circumstances. We are here to do His work. And we need to keep our eye upon Him, trusting Him in it all. So Paul, very confidently, in the midst of adverse circumstances, to say the least, very boldly and very assuredly declares his relation to God. Can we confidently declare at this moment our relation to God in life? If someone were to just ask us, what is your relation to God right now? What would your answer be? Need to give that thought, because it is the most important matter. It is clear, it should be clear to us, our relation to God, as it was with Paul. As it was with Paul. Never, ever allow circumstances to become the main thing. God. God is the main thing. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us